What's more effective, wrestling or jiu-jitsu? No doubt about it. Easy answer to that is both. Okay, so I think 99% of us out there that do grappling or jiu-jitsu, we would agree. We would agree that having both worlds is better. Having both wrestling and jiu-jitsu is better than just having either wrestling or just jiu-jitsu. Okay, so that's an easy one. I think most of us will agree. And the ones who disagree, I think, are out to lunch. They just probably don't have a lot of experience in fighting. However, you're always going to find somebody out there who's going to disagree, right? Okay, so besides both being having the both together, that's the best. Individually, which one is better? Or if you're going to master one over another, which one is better? Well, it's a bit of a trick question, okay? And I'll tell you why. If you master any art, if you master wrestling, judo, sambo, any grappling art whatsoever, in my opinion, you can very easily defend yourself. There's no question about it. Okay, so if you find yourself in a street altercation and you're a judo black belt, you're a sambo master, you're a freestyle or collegiate master, you're going to be able to defend yourself. Okay, for sure. Grappling arts for one-on-one self-defense, in my opinion, is the best. In my opinion, there's no better martial art, okay, than one of these grappling arts. However, jiu-jitsu is very different. It was developed very differently than wrestling. Wrestling was developed in a time-sensitive scenario. Okay, you have 3 rounds of 2 minutes, and you have to wrestle, and you're trying to accumulate points. It's a very brief bout between you and your opponent. Okay, you got about 6 minutes to work against one another. Okay, jiu-jitsu was developed under Vale Tudo rules. Okay, jiu-jitsu was developed in Vale Tudo. Vale Tudo, for those of you who are the younger guys who don't know, Vale Tudo was Portuguese for anything goes. Vale Tudo had no time limit. There was no time limit. Fights could last over an hour very easily. Fights can last 3-4 hours, 5 hours. Fights can last a very, very long time. Now, sometimes fights in Vale Tudo, and they're very well documented. Okay, for those of you who have never seen Gracie in Actions 1, Gracie in Actions 2, they highlight some very, very interesting bouts. Okay, there are many, many classic and famous bouts that lasted hours long, like 3, 4, 5 hours. In a bout like that, not having any finishing holds, okay, and of course jiu-jitsu is all about finishing holds. Wrestling is a little bit, it's not as effective as when you have 3 5-minute rounds like we have in the UFC, Bellator, 1FC. 3 5-minute rounds is far more advantageous for the wrestler. Why? Because I got to take you down, and I just scored my points. I got dominance. I just got to control you for a little bit of time. Now, let's say me and you are fighting, and after 90 seconds, somebody gets a takedown. Well, there's only about, 3 minutes on the clock. Maybe you take somebody down in 2 minutes or whatnot. There's not a lot of time for me to sub you. And if I get you in trouble, let's say everything goes well, and in that 3-minute period is a very brief period to be wrestling between 2 experts, grappling between 2 experts. I get you in a very dangerous position. I mount you. If the bell rings, you're safe. So in MMA, you not only have to survive 5 minutes of grappling at most. Okay, imagine you were taken down the first few seconds. Not only do you only have you have an oasis. All you got to do is survive these 5 minutes. We're gonna reset you. Okay, so you have that oasis in your mind. You have that safety net. All I got to do is survive. The other thing is they're going to start you back in the stand-up position. They're going to let you start all over. That's why I'm so against starting the fight back up on the feet. Like, for instance, if I take you down and I mount you and the round 1 ends, we should start and mount in round 2. We should start and mount. The state should never intervene in the bout. The state brought you back up to your feet. That should never happen. In my opinion, that should almost never happen. That should almost never happen unless there's a deliberate stalling on the part of one of the fighters. I think the bout should always be restarted exactly where it last ended, or as near as we can get it to that. In MMA, we start you back up, back on your feet. If you get in trouble in MMA, and if somebody takes your back, all you got to do is hold that hand and stall and stall and stall and use all your might to hold that arm and defend the choke for 90 seconds, 2 minutes, whatever it is. In Vale Tudo, that wasn't the case. In Vale Tudo, you can stall all you want. You can stall all you want. You have to escape. Stalling will not win you this fight. So jiu-jitsu was developed under a completely different scenario. Completely different scenario. That's why if we had Vale Tudo fights, try to imagine, for instance, whatever bout you want, go back and look at any bout and imagine there was no time limit. Would the fight have ended up differently? And the answer is yes. The answer is just typically yes. One, the fighters will come up with different strategies. Two, the fighters will obviously train differently. Obviously, they're going to be, in it for the long haul. And three, I know, and I understand, guys, please don't lecture me on how it's logistically impossible, pay-per-view, sponsors. I get all that. I'm on board with all that. I'm just saying that the art of the sport, jiu-jitsu is not made, it still hasn't adapted, I should say, to the modern rules. And it is adapting very quickly. And we could talk about that later, because I believe that jiu-jitsu is quickly solving a lot of the problems it's facing now in the UFC octagon. And eventually, it'll go full circle, and jiu-jitsu guys will out-wrestle and out-maneuver and out-take down a lot of the wrestlers out there. Why? Because we're in jiu-jitsu is developing a lot of counters, and I'm going to make a good point. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but give me a minute. I'm going to make a really good point, I think I am, about to clarify that, okay? Jiu-jitsu now is coming up with a lot of different counters to single leg, double leg, body locks that are jiu-jitsu oriented that would be illegal in freestyle wrestling or collegiate wrestling. Okay, so there's going to be a lot more rolling to leg locks. There's going to be a lot more type of guillotines. Like guillotines have taken in the last, I would say, a year and a half, has taken a major leap forward in jiu-jitsu. I don't think we've seen it yet in MMA yet. It's going to get there. It's circulating in the jiu-jitsu community, and it's trickling into the MMA world for sure. But the guillotine game, especially the guillotine game that has come out of the Danaher camp, is light years ahead of what we used to do 2 years ago. Like there's been innovations, and these innovations are going to continue. And this shooting and pulling into leg locks that we see Gary Tonin doing, this is going to come, and we saw Paul Harris doing. This is going to come really quick. The next generations, I believe, are going to be doing a lot of this, and this is not countered by wrestling. It's not in the book of wrestling. Okay, this will be illegal in the book of wrestling to pull guard, to shoot, pull, and leg lock. It'll be illegal, obviously. But these things are coming down the way. They're coming down the way, and when they do, they're going to be very surprising. And fighters are going to have to adapt, and these adaptations are coming. In my opinion, they're coming. Jiu-jitsu has to adapt to the 3-5 minute rule. They have to adapt to the 3-5 minute rule. They're still operating like it's no time limit. Now, a good example of this, a good point, and I told you guys I was going to try to make a good point, is let's look at submission only, like the sub only. We've had now a beautiful sub only era, which I found very entertaining. I like very much. We've seen a lot of, EBI. We've seen a lot of great performances. We've seen a lot of great tournaments from EBI. And what did we see? We didn't see any wrestlers come in and dominate. We've seen grapplers use wrestling and dominate, but it always ended up to who had better grappling skills, jiu-jitsu skills. Wrestling didn't dominate, and wrestling so far in Abu Dhabi right now hasn't been dominating at all. It's all jiu-jitsu guys. There was a time in Abu Dhabi where people would come in, they score a double leg, stall, and they would win. Now they adapted the rules, people adapted strategies, and now you could see all the Abu Dhabi winners are mainly, all of them, jiu-jitsu experts. And in sub only, I can only think of one wrestler beating one really good jiu-jitsu guy, and that was Chad Mendes beat. He beat. Oh my God, forgive me, I'm forgetting it. Glover. He beat Glover. Okay, now how did he beat Glover? The whole. He beat him in. He beat him in Chen. So the whole match he was running. Chad Mendes was running from Glover, Jeff Glover. He was just running, like literally, just like I gotta get away from this guy. He was just completely doing whatever he can to disengage from Glover. Glover was obviously the superior submission artist, grappler, and Chad could take him down, but once he took him down, what could he do? He could just pull out and run. He just like completely defensive. And then they restarted them in the, for those of you who don't know, when you go in overtime, it's kind of like a shootout. I start on your back, then you start on my back, and whoever can sub the other one in the least amount of time wins. Glover subs Chad, and then it's Chad's turn, and Chad just puts the muscle on him. He just kind of squeezes his neck and chokes out Glover faster than Glover choked him out. Now, the event, the promoters put Chad on Glover's back. I personally don't think Chad could ever take Glover's back on his own. He could never kind of take him down, pass his guard, take back. Glover is just too good for that. However, under the rules, he was able to score submission. That's just the only one example I can come up with. And he won, yes, but he needed the rules. He played the rules in a very smart way. He wasn't, the better grappler. If we locked that cage and said, hey, nobody's coming out till somebody gets a sub, I really believe it would be Jeff Glover, get that win. If you cannot stall, jiu-jitsu takes a major leap forward. And I find that if we look really closely as well, whenever there's a jiu-jitsu expert versus a wrestling expert, it usually comes down to the striking. And typically, wrestlers are better strikers than jiu-jitsu guys. That's another observation I've made throughout the years. Typically speaking, like for instance, if we look at Damian Maia versus Kobe Covington, okay? Kobe, in my opinion, lost round 1. He lost the striking in round 1. He didn't get taken down. And he didn't take down Damian Maia. It was a pure striking affair. I found that Damian Maia had stunned him with the left hand. Go back and watch that fight. I thought Damian got round 1. I think most people agreed. I think like 85% of people would agree. Round 2, Kobe, he readjusts and he starts scoring. He defends the takedown, starts scoring. By round 3, Kobe had him hurt bad. I think Kobe would finish him. If there was 5 rounds, I think Kobe would finish him. I think Kobe adjusted in rounds 4 and 5 and really came to life. And he did a fantastic job. However, it came down to striking. Why did it come down to striking? Well, typically, in my observation, wrestlers make for better strikers. Why? Because wrestlers train in a more efficient and intelligent manner than most jiu-jitsu schools. The majority of jiu-jitsu schools train in a way that is less effective than wrestlers. Why? I don't think we can find any wrestling program on the face of the earth that doesn't have a conditioning program embedded in it, okay? They all do standing and ground. However, I can find you 1,001 jiu-jitsu schools where they do no wrestling, they do 0 stand-up, and there's no conditioning curriculum at all. Okay, now I know some schools don't operate that way. Tristar definitely doesn't operate that way. In Tristar, there's wrestling, there's conditioning. We train like wrestlers. Okay, we definitely train jiu-jitsu like wrestlers. However, jiu-jitsu academies are always going to be developing less athletic fighters. Like this young kid's going to go through 10 years of training at a certain academy, a jiu-jitsu academy. Then he's going to decide, I want to do MMA, and he's going to start training like an MMA fighter. However, a wrestler is going to go through high school wrestling. He's going to go through, college wrestling. He's going to be trained like an MMA fighter from day one. He's going to be doing neck bridges. He's going to be doing sprints. He's going to be doing all sorts of things to develop his athleticism. And that athleticism has to be developed in youth. In my opinion, that athleticism has to be developed in your youth. If it's not developed in your youth, man, you're going to be working overtime to develop your athleticism, the potential for your athleticism in your older age. In past 20, in my opinion, you're ready. It's going to be hard now for me to go back and turn the clock. Athleticism, in my opinion, world-class athleticism is typically, there might be a few freaks out there. However, it's typically done when you're very, very young. If you didn't play a lot of sports when you're very, very young, you're always going to be a bit awkward when you're older and when you're trying to learn a new sport. I always try to liken it to a language. Learning a language when you're older, you always have a kind of accent. It's very typical. You have a type of athletic accent. You're not fluid in your attacks and your motion. So that was my critique for that objection. Some people say, oh no, look at wrestling, it does so much better than MMA. Yes, because of time limit, because of the rules, the way things are structured. When I get a takedown, all I got to do is kind of hold you there, win the points, win the domination, and let you go, and then kind of circle around, and I scored my takedown. I just got to be very defensive. If I were to go on the wrestling mat and just be defensive minded, I could stop a lot of their takedowns if I am allowed to run around. And if every time I get partially taken down, all I got to do is hold on for a period of time, they're going to start me back up. I could play the rules. If the rules were structured in a way, I could break even with a wrestler who's much better than me. Now, of course, freestyle wrestling rules are very well designed to avoid all of this, okay? I'm just saying if the rules had a flaw, which I'm trying to say that MMA rules have a flaw. If wrestling rules had a flaw that I could exploit, I can go on the wrestling mat and make a match look a lot more close than it is. That guy's a much better wrestler than me, but because I'm running around, I'm being very defensive, I'm playing the rules, I can make it seem like his wrestling is not that effective. So that's my critique, you know. So if we were wrestling, and for those of you who don't know, I had a grappling event. I was doing pure BJJ. We locked the cage. Nobody can leave this cage until there's a sub. There are no judges. There are no rules. That's why we called it pure BJJ. And I know a lot of you guys ask me to bring it back. I'm gonna try to bring it back. We've been talking about it in the gym. It's just a time issue. Okay, it's just really a time issue. But I eventually will bring it back. Okay. How many subs out of I think the 20 episodes we did, every single one of them was a sub, and only one of them I had to edit because there was some boring parts. Only one. Okay, why? Because the rest, the grapplers thought completely different. They're like, hey, imagine I locked in a wrestler with a BJJ guy, a BJJ expert with a wrestling expert. And I said, look, this cage is locked until somebody gets a sub. I guarantee you that the vast majority of the wins would be jiu-jitsu guys. Now, if it's MMA, I would say it would be more balanced. Why? Because the ground and pound makes a big difference. Okay, ground and pound makes a big difference. It gives the guy on top an advantage. I really think that ground and pound makes a big difference. However, if I had unlimited time, I would react very differently to ground and pound as opposed to having a limited amount of time. So if somebody takes me down, I have to take a lot of risk to make something happen, to get offensive. If it was purely an MMA fight a Vale Tudo fight with no time limit, I would be very, very cautious for a ground and pound. I would put myself in a way that doesn't allow me to get hit. I would strategize very, very differently. Okay, so for those of you out there who are trying to say that jiu-jitsu is useless or whatnot, and you guys are crazy. It's just total craziness. Now, again, that's a very minor opinion. You know, I don't think vast majority of people understand the power of jiu-jitsu. And of course, you know, at the end of the day, this debate is almost mute because everybody should wrestle in jiu-jitsu. If you're a jiu-jitsu practitioner and your school doesn't teach wrestling, find a wrestling club and find 1 or 2 days a week to go and wrestle. Your jiu-jitsu will get stronger. I always tell my students that one of the most, you know, saddest things to see in martial arts is a guy who's really, really good jiu-jitsu, fantastic jiu-jitsu, but has zero ability of takedown. Like, I find it, what would you do if you're in a street altercation? Are you going to sit to guard? No, obviously not. So you're going to be standing up defenseless. You've been training for 20 years. You're a master of jiu-jitsu. But you don't even know how to body lock. You don't even know how to do a kosoto. You don't even know how to do a hip toss. Some jiu-jitsu black belts I've trained with, they know nothing, literally nothing. Like when they try to do takedowns, it looks amateurish. It's embarrassingly amateurish. You cannot be a grappling expert and have no takedowns. It's absurd. At least be a blue belt in wrestling. So if you're ever in a defensive street defense situation, you don't get your butt kicked. Because you may get your butt kicked even though you're a black belt in jiu-jitsu if you have zero takedowns. It's just absurd. It's an absurd amount of a strategy to spend so much time learning how to do things on the ground, but then you didn't spend any time on how to bring somebody to your world. Just for me, it's crazy. And when I see guys pulling guard, like sometimes, really good black belts, they're curious. They want to try the MMA. And they come in on the mat and they just literally, like, they look so beginner. However, they're studs on the ground, you know, and they come from academies that don't have any wrestling. Like, these guys literally have never tried wrestling. So they don't know what it is to shoot a double leg. They don't even know. They're curious. They come on the mat and it looks really crazy, especially in our day and age. We have too much evidence of the importance of wrestling. Just too much. Okay, guys, I got a couple of super chats. I hope I didn't ramble on for too long. Here is the first one. Coach Zahabi, is it too late to develop biomechanics from scratch at 35, blue belt level jiu-jitsu, but zero wrestling? No, absolutely not. Learn wrestling. Wrestling is jiu-jitsu standing up. So enjoy it. Try to shift your paradigm here. Try to think of wrestling as jiu-jitsu standing up. If I do an arm drag standing up, it's the same as if I'm doing it from the ground. Like, I do arm drag a lot from butterfly guard, and I do it a lot from standing up. Why would it change anything? I do duck under from butterfly guard. I should do duck under standing up. The mechanics are quite similar. Now, not all the moves are the same, obviously not, but there are double legs from butterfly guard. So, and sometimes when you're doing a sweep from butterfly guard, you end up standing up with a single leg. So, listen, I'm going to use my wrestling and flow into BJJ. So if I'm wrestling a really good wrestler, like for instance in the video that I have posted, BJJ versus wrestling, I shoot a double leg on my opponent, on my partner. I pull into a leg lock. Why? Because he's going to sprawl. His sprawl is going to beat my double. However, I'm going to now switch into jiu-jitsu mode. That's why I really like watching Gary Tonin. I find that Gary Tonin really has an incredible blend. That's why I loved watching Paul Harris. Because Paul Harris, look at his fight against John Fitch. He caught a single leg on John Fitch. John Fitch was sprawling beautifully, defending beautifully. He pulled into leg lock. Paul Harris pulled him into leg lock. He mixed wrestling and jiu-jitsu. So if you're wrestling somebody who's been using wrestling his entire life, it's crazy to try to out-wrestle him. Use a hybrid. Use your boxing and wrestling together to out-wrestle him. Use your jiu-jitsu and wrestling together to out-wrestle him. Don't try to use pure wrestling. Then you're going into his world. Okay? So that's my answer to you. Definitely use wrestling, learn wrestling, but when you approach a wrestler, you're going to use a hybrid. You're not just going to use straight wrestling.